It's big, it's dumb, it's epic. The Mega Gargant is one of the largest vehicles in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And I'm going to show you how I built it. Well, I'm not going to show you exactly how I built it because I shot over 100 hours footage while building this ridiculous thing. And to put it in technical terms, this build's a bit of a biggie. So I built the main core from MDF since I figured I'd need the strength, and I employed the unpaid labour of a flashlight wielding friend to cut the structural parts that make up the Mega Gargant. One of the great things about laser cut MDF is that once you've done all the hard work in the design, it just sort of flies together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. The downside is once it's together, it looks like a giant jigsaw puzzle. So, like some chilling metaphor for modern life, I encased the entire thing in plastic, styrene sheet to be precise, and I'll cover all of that in detail a bit later in the video. But first, tracks. I quite like the idea of kit bashing the tracks, because, you know, tracks are hard. But reality forced me to design my own that sort of look a bit like a Panzer IV, if you squint. All of the wheels are made from a delicious sandwich of MDF and a material called laserboard. Now, if you don't know laserboard, it's sort of a resin-impregnated card that takes details really well and is still strong even in really thin sheets, so ideal for this kind of thing. And importantly, it doesn't let off toxic fumes when you cut it on a laser, unlike styrene and that whole chlorine gas thing it does when you burn it. Once I'd finished the top level of detail, I threaded together all those little carcinogenic pizzas onto a series of bolts. M4 if you're a bolt spotter. Now, the idea behind that is not only would it provide a decent axle for the wheels, but it would also allow me a method of attaching it to the chassis. Speaking of which, now the chassis is essentially a box made out of MDF, just like the tracks. Now, you'll forgive me if it feels like I'm skipping stuff at the moment. This is a massive build and there's a lot to get through. If you've got any questions, do the comment thing. With the core of the tracks complete, it was time to make it all look less like a fibery box. So it's time to play slap on some plastic. Cut up some 1mm styrene sheet. Take your hobby knife and bevel away the edges to make it look like it was hacked apart with all the enthusiasm of our green-skinned friends. Then it's time for rivets, thousands of them. I decided to use rhinestones at the end because the thought of cutting out thousands of plastic rivets is, well, it's depressing. They look alright though, once you get some paint on them. Like all good Ork vehicles, I decided the Mega Gargant needed a walkway that goes to nowhere. This one's made from more styrene sheet and some evergreen profile that I cut, oversized and then trimmed down to fit once the glue had dried. And after I was done admiring this tread plate patterned styrene sheet, I did the same thing on the top. As the saying goes, all good walkways need a handrail, but I did a really bad job of filming this one, so I'm going to show you how I did it a bit later in the video when we talk about the giant Gatling gun thing. Moving on, I took out my pin vise and drilled some holes into the walkway, rather carefully. I glued in the handrail with some CA glue, and then repeated the process to mount the whole assembly to the side of the tracks. For now, the rest of the work on the track section comprised mostly of throwing on some more pretend armour plates made from styrene. I also started roughing in some basic details because I couldn't help myself. But I was really keen to avoid crowding what is, let's face it, not one of the most important parts of the model. I want viewers' eyes to be drawn towards the head and the guns and stuff. So if I'd gone all in on the tracks, I would have probably had to give it a face like a Giga painting, and nobody wants that. The upper hull of the Mega Gargant is where all the cool stuff happens. It's got a gun battery and, well, that's about it really, but it is where the arms mount, so structurally it's critical to everything else. I wanted to make the arms posable, but more important was the ability to remove them. So I opted to build the shoulder joints from 40mm PVC waste pipe and connectors. Now, looking back at this on the video, the shoulder joints look a little bit flimsy, but remember those rings from the first shot in the sequence? While I didn't actually film it, those are used to reinforce the joint between the PVC pipe and the shoulder. So really, it's the pipe that bears most of the load, not the silly wooden box. Speaking of which, the shoulder's got the old armour plate and bedazzling treatment before being joined to the centre body section. After gluing the two bits of hull together, I did some more armour plating, but that's boring, so let's do a door. I've deviated from the design of the original model and decided to give this one large central door, or butt flap. The original Epic Mega Gargant had 2 rear access doors, situated either side of a third set of tracks, which I've not included because I don't mess with tricycles. After some intense riveting, I dived into the bits box to find some suitable parts to craft a mechanism. I decapitated a zap gun from the battle wagon kit and added some cabling made from guitar strings. I augmented that with some styrene tube section, a power pack from a Space Marine las cannon, some more styrene sheet, and of course, sparkly precious gems. And that's the door, glued onto the back. Now, as I always say, if in doubt, get the drill out. So I did, which made some nice holes to make these ladder rungs I made from styrene tube and jewellery wire. With that step out of the way came a long process of adding more and more armour plates and greebles to help sell the ramshackle orkiness of the whole thing. That's definitely a word. But also to push the narrative that this is a vehicle that's been in use, it's seen action and has been repaired on the go. Also, for some reason, it's got a chimney made from a toy construction pipe in the middle of the gun deck. Grots. Yeah, let's blame it on Grots. I wanted to place some Grot crew members around the Gargant to form little cameos and add some visual interest. Starting with this little menace who's doing some light welding work on the custom force field generator stroke washing line. Then there's this absolute hero with a pair of big shooters taken from a killer can. And this diminutive chap operating a giant lever. I think it might control the big gun, which is concerning. I've gone off piste again with this one. The close combat weapon on the OG Gargant took inspiration from the Crab Claw School of Industrial Design. I think it's in Norfolk. I much prefer my claws to be more construction than crustacean, so copy the design I employed on my Gorkanaut model. So, massive chainsword, 2 giant claws, and Bob's your box crab. Wait, no. All of the pointy bits started life as a forbidden sandwich of MDF, which I hacked out with a file to remove some of the square edges. I then took its little brother file and carved in some battle damage. With things looking sufficiently pointy, I added some armour sections to the upper finger, digit, whatever, as well as some mounting points for pistons, which I'll get to in a minute. The hand section, well, it's just another fancy box to which I bolted the claw and chainsaw parts. M8s, they're M8s. Soon enough, it was time for a little game of Hide the MDF. And then I could move on to the arm, which has a sort of gantry crane style thing going. After succumbing to a particularly virulent strain of foresight, I decided to prime the inside of the arm parts before assembly because, well, getting paint in there afterwards would just be... I mean, can you imagine? That right there is one of those waste pipe connectors I was talking about earlier. I drilled holes in the upper arms with a hole saw, but it turns out 40mm waste pipe isn't 40mm. So I ham-fistedly enlarged the hole with a file, which I didn't get on video, so you just have to imagine it. The upper and lower arm are connected by a pair of lovely M8s. I wanted the arm to be able to articulate so I could pose the model. Bolts made a lot of sense, right up until the point where I added a bunch of pistons that don't articulate and forced me to glue it in place. Speaking of pistons, I made these from evergreen tube, which honestly is a bit pricey for what it is, but it does have the distinct advantage that they offer a range of sizes that telescope inside each other, which is exactly what you need for pretend pistons. For the hydraulic hoses, I used aluminium armature wire. I quite often use brass wire for this kind of thing as it's a little bit more robust, especially on models that you're likely to be handling. But the aluminium wire is easier to bend into convincing shapes that look like they conform with the model and, physics. When it came to creating some of the larger pistons I needed, I realised I didn't have any styrene tube in an appropriate size, so I raided my stash of these kids' toy construction tubes, which you can get from Joffrey B's Best Book Emporium, or, somewhere less totalitarian. I'm a big fan of those little tubes. They're dirt cheap and they find their way into almost every project, including all over the arm, which, as you can see, is done. So let's do something shooty. The OG Mega Gargant was armed with a giant cannon called a Skull Crusher, and to be honest with you, I prefer lasers. So I looted, see what I did there? Another old epic favourite, the Super Zap Gun. As with earlier parts of the build, the core of the Zap Gun's made from a couple of boxes of MDF. I attached a couple of cool looking rail attachment point things to the top so it had something to connect to the arm before moving on to the pointy end. Oh, that was weird. So obviously it's another bit of PVC waste pipe. I decided to surround it in a sort of MDF exoskeleton to make it look more sci-fi and less under the sink, before turning my attention to the Zap Gun's emitter. Now, the dangerous end follows the tried and true sort of trident design that turns up in a lot of Ork energy weapons. And this kind of assembly really demonstrates one of the big advantages of being able to use a machine to cut 2D material in such a precise way. As you can see, it all slotted together rather nicely. With the main core of the Zap Gun complete, it's time for an armour plate montage before moving on to some of the more unique details. For instance, there's this massive coolant radiator I made, complete with cute little paperclip pipes, a bunch of greebly bits that I added to the surface, of course more armour plates, and then it was walkway time, which is the best time. I used more of that tread plate pattern styrene that I showed you earlier, drilled some holes, added some 0.9mm brass wire, and some styrene rod for the rail. It's not rocket science, it's a laser. If it sounds like I'm getting a bit flippant as the video goes on, it's because, well, there's so much repetition in this build. I mean, look, there's more pistons. Anyway, I did the pistons, glued the two bits of the gun together, and I had a laser. So, time for something with a bit more dacker. I kind of went my own way again with this one. The OGMG had a frankly preposterous Weird Boy tower and a big lobber mounted on giant gantries, and that just didn't feel right to me, so I changed it out for a frankly preposterous Gatling gun, obviously. The design's quite straightforward really, 5 large rotating barrels, inside each of which are 3 smaller rotating barrels, which is 15 barrels, feels about right. In order to save weight, I built the body of the Gatling gun with a sort of skeleton frame construction, which led to what was easily the most frustrating part of the build, and carefully applying the skin of 20 thou styrene is a nightmare I really don't want to repeat anytime soon. And speaking of nightmares, here's that handrail soldering tutorial I promised some time ago. Brass rod is by far the best material for this job. It's strong, it resists damage, and it conducts heat really well. Once you've cut all of your pieces to size, you really need a secure way of holding all of the parts. It doesn't have to be fancy, a bit of scrap wood, some tape, job's a good one. Arguably more important than anything else is to apply a separate flux paste to the joints. This helps clean the metal, allows the solder to flow into the gaps, and honestly it's like playing on cheat mode. With the flux applied, you really only need to touch the joint for a small amount of time to allow the heat to build up, dab in some solder, and let it cool. All that's left to do is clean up and blend in the joints using a needle file and some fine emery paper, and then, do what comes naturally, jam it in some holes. The detail on the back of the gun was built up with various layers of MDF and styrene as before. For reasons that I'm struggling to explain, I decided to put a door on the back, as well as adding a rope ladder made from strands of twisted wire to help any orcs that, I guess, can't climb a ladder on their own. I really didn't think that through. Thankfully, I did think through how I was going to mount this thing to the back of the Gargant's power pack. Once again, I used 40mm waste pipe and connectors, but this time of the compression fit variety. In theory, the rubber O-ring inside would stop the Gatling gun from spinning around on its own accord, and it does. Let's build some rockets. The original had 2, I'm adding 5. I don't think I need to explain why. You'll be shocked to learn that these started out as 40mm waste pipe, which I gave a bit of a sand because, we want paint to stick to them. I added a couple of protruding pegs into the MDF fins so I'd have some way of attaching them into the rocket body itself. Since the curved surface of the missile would present a very small surface area for glue to hold, I figured it probably needed something a bit more secure than hopes and dreams. Anyhow, I marked up the rocket bodies, drilled multiple holes, and then elongated the lower set of holes with a hobby knife so they'd have a rectangular aperture to receive the fins. Then it was time to break out the mathematics to try and calculate the shape I'd need for the nose cone, which, that failed, so I found an online calculator instead. Forming the nose cone profiles from 0.25mm sheet probably ranks amongst the hardest things I've ever done, but I did get better as I went along. With all that troublesome geometry business behind me, I formed an appropriately crude impact detonator from some styrene tube and hex section, before throwing some rhinestones in the general direction of the rockets, and repeating the whole process 4 times. I'd forgotten that I still need to make the launcher, so yeah, let's speedrun this, because honestly it's not very interesting, it's just a box. Well, actually, it's not just a box, it's a box on a gantry. It's a Mega Gargant. You need gantries. I should probably move on to the head. Yeah, well, let's do the head. So basically, the head's a fancy box. As we've established, geometry isn't my strong suit. And because this box is in fact fancy, I roughed out the shape in Fusion 360, which is an invaluable tool for this sort of thing, and it's completely free for personal use, so top tip. To round out the basic detailing, I added a handrail because, you know, orcs are pretty safety conscious, as well as a door onto a walkway with a ladder leading to the roof, the top, the scalp. Anyway, whatever you call it, it needed an orc. A nice little kit bash to round out the old cranium. In my head, it's an anti-aircraft mount because, amusingly, if it's a regular big shooter, it barely makes range to the ground. This thing's got 9 turrets. I looked it up on Wikipedia, and that's about 8 more than most military vehicles have. The turrets on the front of the hull were designed in Fusion 360, and breaking tradition, I built them from a MDF box covered in styrene sheet. 4 of the turrets carry a pair of cannons that are cut down from 15mm copper tube using a tube cutter, which is pretty hard to do on video without looking a bit stupid. And speaking of stupid, I decided to add reinforcement to the front of the muzzle using a series of laser-cut MDF rings. These look pretty awful. I tried to sand them down, that didn't work. Made a concave sanding tool for some spare plumbing, which sort of worked but very slowly. And then I just embraced my inner orc. Now, there's an argument to be made that the combination of fast-spinning tool, electrical tape and fingers is a bad one. And yeah, it's probably quite a compelling argument. As you can see, all 11 digits made it through the sanding process unscathed. By the way, that's 2 pieces of 40mm waste pipe there, and they're different sizes. Plumbers are sadists. That discrepancy turned out to be pretty useful actually, because it allowed me to make this big gun, which broke up the monotony of making 5 identical turrets. As you can see, I hadn't really planned on making a larger gun, so I had to blend its profile into the turret using an offcut of, well, more waste pipe. I filled the gaps with some sprue goo, made from Tamiya Extra Thin and some offcuts of styrene, tidied everything up, added a few more details from some bits of MDF and plastic, you know, the usual sort of thing, and that was 5 turrets. So, 4 to go. Well, that was definitely quicker doing it that way. And that's all 9 turrets haphazardly placed on the Mega Gargant. I mean, look at the one on the far left, the state of that. And I couldn't even get the top one in the middle. I mean, come on, basics, man. Anyway, the last major part of the model to build was a power pack that sits on the back. Being an Ork vehicle, it's covered in smokestacks, but it's also the mounting point for the Gatling gun and the cruise missile battery. You can tell I was having fun with a laser cutter at this point. I mean, can you imagine cutting out all of those radiator grills by hand? To mount the Gatling gun, I built a trapezoid box that would sit on the side of the power pack assembly. Thanks in no small part to the genius that decided that 15 copper barrels was a good idea, the Gatling gun is the heaviest part of the model. So for peace of mind, I decided to entomb the mounting tube within the box. It's actually pretty good that you can't see inside there because, honestly, it's a bit of a glue-pocalypse. Right, let's use up the last of that 40mm pipe. To help disguise the plumbing vibes and sell the scale a little bit better, I added reinforcing bands from 0.5mm styrene and crafted some small rings from aluminium wire, which I would later use to attach some rigging, as well as these little reinforcing strips I cut on the laser, which I think helped sell the whole ramshackle deal. Somehow I managed to lose the footage of attaching the power pack to the back of the Gargant, but I think you get the vibe if you picture glue and swearing. And speaking of swearing, I made the big brain decision to make the rigging from twisted wire rather than one of the many commercially available products that shipbuilders use for their rigging. Honestly, this was just awful, and watching the footage back, it's making me... That's better. Nice, soothing piano. And that's the build of the Mega Gargant wrapped up. Evidently there's still a bit of filling, rust effects and of course paint to go, but we'll get to that in a moment. And look, it's those rigging cables. They turned out acceptably, I suppose. Alright then, let's get some paint on you. I started priming the model and then realised I'd forgotten to seal any of the MDF parts. Now this stage isn't strictly necessary as long as you don't mind your MDF looking swollen and fuzzy. There are lots of products you can buy for this, but I've always found a 50-50 mix of PVA and water is more than good enough. With the MDF cuteness issue defeated, I got back to priming. I used Vallejo surface primer for this because honestly the thought of blasting through half a dozen rattle cans on a project like this didn't really appeal. Even still, I managed to aerosolise nearly 400 millilitres of Vallejo's finest over the 2 coats I applied to the model. It's actually really easy to underestimate just how much time every process on a model like this takes. I think the next one needs to be considerably smaller. Anyway, it's rust time. I used Vallejo earth texture, liberally applied all over the model to provide a rust texture. And definitely didn't use any of it to hide any small gaps I'd missed during the days of filling and sanding. I tried to build up the density in areas that I thought water would collect, and then feather away the edges to blend it into the surface, which actually worked out really well. With the beige hidden away, I added a small amount of white paint to my primer mix and focused my attention on the centres of various panels and raised surfaces to give the black paint a faded look. Not only does this help sell the sense of scale, it adds to the weathering and it brings out a bunch of details that would otherwise be obscured in stark black primer. Which is great because I had no intention of going in and brush highlighting thousands of individual parts of the model. Mostly because I don't think it looks particularly good at this kind of scale, but also because, well, I'd still be doing it now. The next job was to go in and add a basic dark brown tone to all of the rust patches and around every single rivet, all 5,000 of them. I'd be going in and adding lighter tones a bit later, but at this stage I just wanted to get a good feel for the colour density of the model. And shockingly enough, things were looking a bit on the dark side. So I broke out the stencils. This process was incredibly nerve-wracking, not because I was worried I'd ruin the paint job underneath, that would be easily repainted, but recutting all of those checker patterns isn't something I want to do anytime soon. It all turned out okay though, and any tiny bits of overspray that were apparent were easily hidden in the weathering. For the sake of expediency, most of this was undertaken with an airbrush using the dark brown and dark grey mixes that I'd made previously. And there's a little bit of dry brushing here and there, but I didn't film that and you already know what that looks like. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip to the head now. The faceplate was given a coat of USN light grey primer, followed by a top coat of white. Then it was time to give the eyes the old glowing treatment with some quick and dirty objective source lighting. At this stage I thought I should probably break out the Citadel paints and started with a base of Mephiston Red from the Air range, followed by progressively lighter shades near the centre mixed with Troll Slayer and Jacaro Orange. And that's the basics of how I painted pretty much everything on the model. Of course there were hundreds of details that I went in and hand painted the conventional way, but honestly there's nothing particularly interesting about the technique, and I really want to keep the video runtime under 7 or 8 weeks. So here's the finished model. All in all, I have to say I'm pretty happy with how the Mega Gargant turned out. Now, of course, with any project this scale it's never quite finished, and there's a bunch of little details I'd still like to add and some paintwork I'd like to refine, but for now, I'm calling it a day. I am a little bit worried that it won't fit through the door of the room I built it in though, so that's something I've got to deal with. I hope you found the video informative, perhaps even inspiring, or maybe a little entertaining. If you didn't enjoy it, then I really don't understand why you're still watching. Maybe fell asleep or something. Which, you're welcome, because, you know, sleep's important. Look, what I'm trying to say is, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you again next time. You did hit that subscribe button, didn't you?